the end we are, no, we're right. No, not everything. No, we don't need the camera. So after this small and common technical problems, I think now it's time to start this talk by Soraya Boudia. Let me first of all to thank Soraya for being here with us. It's a pleasure to have you with us discussing all this topic about ignorance and agnotology, which is part of our project, ongoing project, in which we are involved, many people from this center and other groups from Barcelona. You will be in Barcelona giving a talk in 2 days, I guess, at the Institut de Historia de la Ciencia, with the other people who are also involved in this project. So just a few words to present Soraya Boudia, who is a historian and sociologist of science, technology, and environment, from professor of sociology at the Université Paris Cité, and member of the Center on Medicine, Science, Health, Medical Health and Society, CERME 3, from the CNRS, the INSER, the Medical Research Center, the École des Hautes Études de Sciences Sociales, and the Université Cité de Paris. She is a historian of science, sociology of science, who started in the 90s working on the Marie Curie laboratory. I guess she was a curator of the Marie Curie Museum for a while in the 90s, I guess. And then she kept working on topics related to radioactivity, but particularly on risk and the sociology of risk and the sociology and history of toxic products. And she edited and published, sometimes with, many times with our colleague and friend Natalia, many different books, crucial books, some of the most important books in the last decade on the history of toxic products and toxic risks. Many of them we have in this library, but just let me say, let me mention this book, Powerless Science: The Making of the Toxic World in the 20th Century, in 2014, which is probably one of the most important books in this new history of toxic risk. And she has been also involved in the studies of the making of ignorance in the last years. She has published many edited books, papers, and issues of journals, and one of these books is this one about the regulation of the toxic world. And he has published also in the last years other similar books introducing the studies on ignorance. And that is going to be the topic of this talk, which is about ignorance studies, recent trends, and future avenues. So, Soraya, thank you very much for being here, and you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I think I have to speak to the computer and to you in the same time. So thank you, Jose Ramon, and thank you, Simo, for inviting me to give this talk and have the occasion to share with you some ideas and having an open discussion. I imagine this seminar as conversation. I will give some points to open this discussion. First, I have to say that I have had a very complex relationship to ignorance, because of course it's a huge topic discussed mainly in risk, environmental and sanitary risks. and Nathalie Jas, as you mentioned, we worked a lot together, and we had a long discussion for years on ignorance, what to do with that. And in the beginning, we were not very involved in these issues, but we were in conversation with colleagues involved in this discussion. And maybe during the COVID period, I don't know, it was like a good period to think the work I did with some of my PhD students and other colleague, Emmanuel Henry. We published a small book in French on the politics of ignorance. Is probably the products of this period of the COVID, but it wasn't especially on the COVID at all. It was really this, I mean, I will come back to that, to try to see how was the reception of the work on agnotology and ignorance studies probably in France. What was the kind of perspective offered by this work that were helpful for us, but also how we see how to broaden maybe these studies. So I will start first by something is, see how we are ignorant about how to use the techniques, but this will be my topic. I will speak in English, which is even if I can write and read English very well, I'm not so comfortable, in fact, in English. So I hope that you will understand me quite easily. I will start my talk by saying that ignorance as a research topic is in vogue. It's in vogue in sociology, in history, in anthropology for more than a decade. And one important indication of this importance of the topic in the academia is the publication of this handbook on ignorance studies published by Matthias Kroos and Leslie McGoy in 2015. Yeah. And this is a very interesting handbook which provides an historical and cross-disciplinary overview of the research topic. So what I want to do in this talk is to give you an overview of recent trend in the study of ignorance. I'm sure that you are familiar with most of these works, because they are becoming, it's very interesting, but they are becoming quite classical in few years, even if we do not have always very theoretical book on this work. Maybe this is a point we can discuss, how a field is constructed and what we can make as classical studies in the field, but maybe perhaps in 20 years, everybody will forget about this work. So I don't know how classical will be this work, but what I don't know also is if we really have an ignorance study field. This is this handbook was supposed to be the first book of series with several books on ignorance, but in fact, even if we had many books on ignorance, we still do not have like huge set of works on the ignorance. So let us see what this work, what this research introduce as new things, but also the limit. And I want to share with you some thought of the limit on this work. And my second point, as I said, is to initiate a conversation maybe on the future avenues or how to try to grow the ignorance studies. Sorry. I'm a little bit suffering from allergy, so when I speak, my talk will be organized around 4 points, sorry. The 3 first points are introduction of the research. I mean, in a way, I classified them. I'll come back to that. As you can see, I do not classify all the ignorance studies under the banner of agnotology. Agnotology is for me a group of work. Other works on ignorance studies sometimes are put in the same under the same name. In other times, no, because they are in discussion. We can come back to that also. So agnotology, London science, the new political sociology of science and institutional production of ignorance. And the fourth point is really to open the discussion about what to do with the ignorance studies today, mainly at the age of global crisis, environmental crisis, but more than environmental crisis. So let's start with the agnotology. I think this book is very important introduction to the ignorance studies. There is a strong proposition to study ignorance under the name of agnotology, but it's important to say first that this is not the first book on ignorance. Ignorance is in some way an old topic. There was work on ignorance after the Second World War in the 60s. There was a book on sociology of ignorance. Ilana Louis translated part of the book. But the book of Proctor and Proctor play an important role because and Londa Schreiber, because we mainly know the work of Proctor, but when they published this book, and this book was published after two important workshops, the making of ignorance and ontology, it was like the beginning of set of works, and important works by important scholars, very visible in the academia, and it play an important role. So I will not say too much about the book. We can come back to that also, but the way that the first sentence of the book, "We live in the age of ignorance," is very strong affirmation, and it gives us the sense of what Proctor was, aimed to do with this book. It's really to think about ignorance, the making, the lost and forgotten of knowledge. It's mainly on the knowledge, and to promote the study of ignorance. It was another way to study the knowledge by promoting the study of ignorance, developing a tool to understand how forms, I'm just reading some forms of knowing have not come to be or disappear, or have been deleted or neglected, or for better or for worse. It's a very large program. It's a very ambitious program. So the author of agnotology provide us a new, this is like theoretical perspective to broaden the traditional question of what is knowledge, how knowledge is produced or not produced, etc. And as we will see, but it's more than just studying the knowledge. It also, a focus on the cultural and political struggles around the knowledge. So the concept of agnotology has been very successful in academia with very visible books, mainly on tobacco and pesticide, or on the global warming, on occupational health, public health, etc. I'll try to highlight some of the key results of this work. But before doing that, what I want to do is to let you see how Proctor and Naomi Oreskes present the work, because it's very important to see what was the initial project and what they did with this theoretical perspective.
Stanford University. we only really know what we know about the history of tobacco because of the disclosure through litigation of the so-called secret documents. This is a vast trove of over 70 million pages of formerly secret tobacco industry documents. These tell a tale of the design of the cigarette, of the effort by the industry to create a device that would create and sustain addiction. If you have people try different types of cigarettes, they can't really tell one type from another because the cigarette itself is, they're basically all the same. The cigarette contains hundreds of different ingredients ranging from castoreum, which is a secretion from the anal gland of the Siberian beaver, to humectants like glycerin and exotic flavorants and most of the world's licorice. The cigarettes don't sell unless they deliver nicotine because people are addicted. Every year there are 6 million people who die from smoking worldwide, and those are really unnecessary deaths. A great deal of design effort has gone into making this very ordinary product into something that's irresistible, seductive. Most people who smoke, 80 or 90% actually, are addicted, and in fact, cigarettes are as addictive as heroin or cocaine. You've got Santa Claus advertising cigarettes here with the idea being that you should give cigarettes as gifts. The pack of the cigarette itself has become the last bastion of tobacco advertising, a kind of micro ad, and it's one of the reasons that so many countries are starting to push for plain packaging. Imagery is everything. People want to hold these. The American shirt pocket goes right with it. The cigarette is maintained by an elaborate collaboration with academics. Scholars from every discipline have collaborated in keeping the tobacco industry going. They serve as witnesses in court. They advise on the manufacturing properties. They advise in the marketing or the sale. And this is really an undisclosed collaboration that is responsible for the continuation of the tobacco epidemic. It's really kind of like a shadow profession that's gone on behind the scenes, and there's no accountability here. Basically, no part of culture has been exempt and has not been used in order to sell cigarettes. There are lots of things that can be done. The FDA now has the power to regulate the content of cigarettes, and they should take the nicotine as low as possible. The law actually has been written so they can't entirely bar nicotine from cigarettes, but they could reduce it to a level that is so low it would not be able to create sustained addiction. Cat food and dog food have been more carefully regulated than what goes into cigarettes. Part of this huge burden of death is the result of basically negligence and the industry having a free hand.
So now I will let you to see what Oreska said about her work.
Well, a key part of the strategy from the very beginning is to undermine the idea of scientific consensus, because there are many, many studies that show this, and one of the things we know about the tobacco industry and also some of the early work done by the fossil fuel industry is they actually studied these things. They did market research with focus groups to figure out what is effective in changing people's minds about these matters. And one of the things they discovered in their own market research was that if you can persuade people that there's no scientific consensus, then people will think that it would be premature to act. So if you're the tobacco industry, the government is proposing regulation, proposing tobacco control, and you're trying to push back tobacco control, you say, well, hold on a minute, we don't really know that smoking is dangerous. There's no scientific consensus. And market research shows that if you persuade people that there's no consensus, they say, yeah, well, in that case, let's wait and see. So it's a very, very powerful strategy that we know works. And this is why you hear them saying as a kind of mantra, there's no consensus, the science isn't settled, we have experts who don't agree, there's still a lot of uncertainty, there's considerable uncertainty, you hear this phrase, considerable uncertainty, repeated over and over again. And of course, part of the strategy is to stay on message. So they'll say this over and over and over again, there's a lot of doubt, there's considerable uncertainty, and this is where the title Emergence of Doubt came from, because they're selling doubt. And of course, we know that They even admitted that themselves, because one of the most famous documents in all of the tobacco, millions and millions of pages of tobacco documents, is a document in which an industry executive says, doubt is our product.
So what I want you to keep in mind is what was the project of agnotology in the beginning, and how Proctor and Oreskes present the work few years after. And I want just to finish with another interview of Proctor. It was with the French media, but it's in English, how the scholars, in fact, moved from scholar analysis to political involvement on their topic.
We live in a world of military secrecy, a world where large, powerful corporations create bodies of ignorance deliberately. Years ago at Harvard, and I noticed that cigarettes were the leading preventable cause of death in the United States and the world more generally. I started realizing that the tobacco industry was deliberately creating ignorance through what I call distraction research. They were massive funders of research into everything but cigarettes causing cancer. And actually at least 25 Nobel laureates have taken money from big tobacco, and they essentially brainwashed the public to that effect. And that's why we still have 6 trillion cigarettes smoked worldwide every year.
Is not addictive. Cigarettes and nicotine clearly do not meet the classic definitions of addiction. There is no intoxication. We'll take that as a no.
I realized this was a template for denial of all kinds of harms. You know, the Lead Institute says that lead doesn't cause brain harm. You know, the Global Climate Coalition says that climate change is a myth and a fantasy. So the tobacco denial framework, that distraction research, that decoy research, that became a template for lots of other powerful industries to deny that they're causing harm. And so that's why we say big oil is the new big tobacco. We live in a world of ignorance. Ours is, in fact, I call it golden age of ignorance. We live in a world where misinformation spreads at the speed of light. And no one was studying this. If you have something like Twitter or something like Facebook, where you can buy information and buy advertising and actually buy page ranks and manipulate page rank and plant stories, it becomes much cheaper, much easier for a few bad actors to have an enormous influence. And it's not just by a few bad actors like big tobacco or big oil, but now governments of all kinds and all kinds of other bad actors. I think we need organized resistance against the distributors of big misinformation. And that's a lot of that can be done just by shining light on it.
So this is, I mean, I think it's important to see how these colleagues present the work and how it's involved in, I mean, they involved in some way from really academic work. They were in the best universities, Stanford, Harvard, to become a public voices on the question they are dealing with. So what I want to do now, before coming back to what they said, I will not comment too much what they said, but I want to highlight some of the new things presented as new approach proposed by agnotology. The first point for me is that the novelty in agnotology is not the dissimulation of data. In fact, in the book, the practice of secrecy, embargo of data was an important point in the book on agnotology, especially in the nuclear industry studied by Peter Gallison in the book. But in what Proctor wrote after and what he said is that the novelty is not there. The novelty is in the use of the industry of the doubt. And why it's new? Because for Proctor and others, the doubt is a legitimate approach in science. It's scientific approach to the way to deal with the problems. And so the industry is erecting a scientific approach publicly as a systematic approach to challenge the knowledge. So, I mean, Proctor really highlight this point many times. So the intentional production of scientific doubt in scientific and public spaces was done by collaboration, relying on set of allies, often generously funded scientists, journalists, having a common strategy with driven objective, which was really against regulation. So the American context here is very important. We are in 90s, and the first workshops were in the end of 90s, and of course, all the 80s years, and the debate in the American space, and even after with the fake news, etc., make these colleagues, these academics people, very involved in the public debates around what was happening in the US. So, of course, this is not strategy, the direction of doubt or the systematic approach of the problems with promoting doubt is not American strategy. This is, of course, an international one, but the studies we had were mainly focused on the US. And for Proctor and others, the objective of, as Oreskes said it very clearly, I think, in her interview, the objective each time is to avoid the scientific consensus. So to avoid the scientific consensus by attacking some scientists at personal level, or by organizing distraction research, as Proctor said, by producing very different sets of data which make people think that there is uncertainty. But what we can see is that this author gave to the scientific consensus and the importance of scientific consensus. They give very important role to the scientific consensus, and in some way we can think that scientific consensus can be obtained each time if the industry do not intervene. So there is, we can come back to this point because it's very important point, the place given to the scientific consensus and to the scientists, the good and bad actors, say Proctor. So to think who are the bad, who are the good actors. The good actors are those who work to obtain the scientific consensus. The bad actors, of course, are the actors against regulation, but mainly against science. So it isn't always clear, and there's differences between Oreskes and Proctor, who are the bad actors in this story. So the anthropology as field of work, of course, open something very new and led many scholars to be interested in what ignorance can say about our, comprehension of society. But agnotology was also, faced several critiques in science and technology studies, because it's personally grasped the different way in which ignorance is produced and different form of no decision in regulatory agencies or at regulatory policy. I will not develop too much this aspect, but the discussion on the global warming or on the toxic is also a discussion on public policy, on public action. So another way to deal with the ignorance study is really to try to think what are the dynamics of public decision. What are the elements that make public authorities making decision about the toxics or about industries, etc. So is it just a matter of knowledge? Is it just a matter of consensus? So this is another way to tackle this issue. And one of the important critics came from the new political sociology of science. Is not it's in French, nearly in French. I don't know how you are familiar with the new political sociology of science. I will not introduce what is the political sociology of science. It's mainly propositions from colleagues, American colleagues, and it's now, it's used, of course, outside the US. I just want to mention here two important books, a handbook in science, technology, and society, and a book by Frickel and Moore. I can give you more details on political sociology of science because I want really to promote this kind of approaches. And this approach really, the colleagues involved in these two books, but also in research in this field, were probably the ones who introduced the most, stimulating critiques to the agnotology. One main point is that for them is that agnotology offers a narrow conceptualization of ignorance. And for them, it's really problematic because it's based on the misguided that the production of ignorance result from deviant science. You can have consensus, you can have good and bad actors, etc. So I will comment this after. And for one point that agnotology scholars highlighted is that we need greater level of public transparency, which will let science less deviant and which will reduce the scientific consensus. And so what we can say is that the politics of science is conceived in quite different way in agnotology and in new political sociology of science. So the main critics, and Scott Frickel is, I come back to that, is the one of this colleague who made these critics, is that the agnotology is really focused on conspirational view of ignorance, and it's reducing the other, mechanism of production of ignorance. It's focused mainly on the issue, on the question of intentionality. You have strategic actors acting in a very organized way with a lot of money, etc. So this critics led to the development of several works in the new political sociology of science, but maybe we can just make a point here to say that these colleagues are mainly discussing, I would say, the second set of work of agnotology, the works that Proctor and Oreskes presented in the interview I let you show. If we come back to the book of, on agnotology of 2008, it's not really true. So my point is really to highlight that because of maybe the success of the approach of agnotology based on the critics of industry, which was also used by several journalists, media, especially in France, for example. We have very good studies by journalists showing the conflict of interest or the very deviant way in which the industry is able to act. And this other part of the program of agnotology, which is the missing knowledge, how the knowledge disappear or is forget, all the other mechanisms are less visible and less discussed in the academia. So what I want to show you is what the new political sociology proposed as a response, or what other way they propose to study the ignorance. One of the important work done by a group of scholars is on the undone science. I think that the majority of you probably heard about undone science now. It's becoming something very, not just popular, but even known by regulatory agencies, at least in France. Now they know what is undone science, and it's even translated as a concept. And it's important. Why this approach is important? It's important for different reasons. First, the definition of undone science. We can have different definition in literature. The group is, you have here the main name: Scott Frickle, David S., Barbara Allen. I come back to that. It's really to think about the absence of knowledge, the situation when we do not have enough data, when data is needed to make a decision. And why it's important to highlight this, because Proctor and others, what they highlighted is that the production, the industries produce mini data to undermine the scientific consensus, to produce uncertainty in the public space. So the argument of the political sociology of science is really to say, no, there are many cases, especially when it comes to toxic and to the environmental issues, when we do not have enough data, in fact, when we need to produce data. So just to let you see, I think it's a very fine argument. So it's that the problem is not to have always too many data and it's easy to have consensus. In many cases, the problem is the lack, the missing data. So this is a first point. The second point is, in their definition, is that the undone science is this kind of science that civil society organization or social movement organization needs sometimes to identify problem, to answer to some questions, especially on environmental and health risks. So what they mean by that is, of course, scientific data are important to protect. Scientific consensus is important for decision making, but in many cases we have data, or we have a kind of data which do not lead us to conclude something concerning risk, concerning environmental risk, concerning the kind of problems people are facing. To say it another way is that, of course, we can have scientific data, which doesn't mean that it's good data to make decisions for people. This is another way maybe to say it. So the political sociology of science describe the Andean science as area which are left unfunded, ignored. This is another ignorance, ignored even by scientists. So it's not just a matter of industry, it's also a matter how science function. And why these colleagues highlight so much the issue of Indian science is because part of them were looking how to remediate to this kind of situation. So their political involvement was different from the one of Proctor and Oreskes. I don't want to, how to say, caricature, to make position very strong, but the political involvement of Proctor and Oreskes and others is to introduce in the public space a debate about the status of scientific data and to protect science. What is under attack is information, is the truth, is science. The point of colleagues from the new political sociology of science is not this one. It's really to say that in many cases, especially when it comes to environmental exposure, there are groups, social groups who are exposed, communities, workers, etc., and who sometimes are ill or suffering from this situation, and nobody produced data on them. So we have missing knowledge. So how we can remediate to this kind of situations is to develop new source of funding to get more data on some topics. So to promote independent foundation, civil society organization, social movements. Part of this colleague works a lot with social movements, etc. And to promote, even if there is a mini discussion on that, citizen science, community-based research, popular epidemiology, strong participatory research, etc. So I don't know if I'm clear. What I want to let you see is really the different political position of these colleagues compared to the agnotology. So to remediate to this Indian situation, some of these colleagues propose to design studies in very different way. I just want to mention the work of Barbara Allen, who conducted the very important work on strongly participatory research in the south of France. She worked first on Louisiana, and she come back to Louisiana now to work on Louisiana now, but she conducted research in France in area which is one of the hotspot of toxicity in the south of France, and with the team, she show how the rate of asthma, cancer, diabetes, disease in the communities was important compared to the other places in the country, where the public agencies or the public health or scientists working on this area were saying before there was no problem, or there was very little rate of cancer. And why this study is important? Because this study really is challenging today the public agencies in France, because it was conducted with epidemiologists based on methodology, with the data, with interviews of people. And the point of Barbara Allen was to say that we are producing knowledge you are not producing in epidemiology. it was to say that the way you frame your studies, the way you deal with communities, do not help these communities to know better about their health, especially about their health. And this study is really changing things, because now there is doctors in the south of France who are trying to work in this perspective. There are other places where people are calling to have such kind of studies. And these studies make the two public agencies working on public health in France not very comfortable, because they criticized the study before. The study was funded by one of these agencies, because the one in charge of environment is really open to this kind of approaches. And now these agencies are really thinking how we can change part of our practices to better integrate this kind of approaches, which are more community-based research. I will not say more about that, but just to let you see how things can be changed by remediation on knowledge produced by colleagues. Very quickly, I want to highlight the third group of work on institutional production of knowledge. I would say that we can have like two sets of works on institutional production of ignorance and not knowledge. It's very interesting. The one proposed by Scott Frickle and Michelle Edwards, I think you know about it. This is an important work on analysis of risk assessment process on soil contamination in New Orleans after Katrina. So what Scott Frickle and Michelle Edwards show is that we can produce knowledge, of course, and regulatory agencies produce knowledge, but in the same time, they produce ignorance. So the problem is not just to having undone science. There is other mechanism of producing ignorance, which are more institutional, which are more everyday production of ignorance in some way, because of the way the studies are conceived and designed. And I will not, I will let you read the text of Scott Frickle and Michelle Edwards, because it's very interesting detailed study on the risk assessment and how the risk assessment narrow the question which are, studied and how they are studied. Another important study is the one on the vanishing bees, but I think that I will not have enough time to say too much on this study. So what the institutional production of ignorance let us know about ignorance is that, as I said, the regulatory agencies often narrow the way they studied the risk. And this is highly problematic from a political point of view, because this is not intentional suppression of knowledge. It's not, we are not at all in the agnotology paradigm. It's more routine production of ignorance. It's more, I would say, everyday production of ignorance, which is sometimes very difficult to localize or to see. So the emphasis on the logic, the institutional logic is really an appeal or from these colleagues to broaden the way we see the ignorance. The ignorance can be located in risk assessment, it can be located in models, can be located in the standards, can be located in in each part of the studies, the way we design the studies, what we should to study or not to study, and it's really more broad. So it's ignorance can be everywhere, and it's not always intentional. But I mean, the intention and no intention is very complicated issue in ignorance studies. The second way institutional ignorance was studied is a very heuristic approach developed by Lindsay McGoy. Lindsay McGoy is one of the editor of the handbook I mentioned in the beginning. She's a sociologist, and her approach is quite different than the one. She's not studying science. She mainly studied organizational sociology, and she works on strategic value of institutional logic in the production of ignorance. And one of the things she challenges is the assumption that knowledge is a power, because in agnotology, when you have data, etc. So the argument of Lindsay McGoy is she worked on industries. She has a wonderful work on drug industries and on philanthropia in Africa, etc. Her argument is that the use of ignorance is more powerful when the industries know very well how to use it as a tool of governance and social control. And in many cases, what is very powerful is to know what to produce and not to produce. And in many cases, the thing is not to produce so many data, is not to produce data, or to have a strategic use of ignorance, which part of things are, how to say that, in chain of informal things. You can know some things, but you can produce even knowledge, but never write it. Let people from your institution write anything. You know, this is very used in everyday institution. We can say something between us, but never write it, etc. And she really studied this in very fine way too, because this kind of industries have a high degree of knowledge how to not be how to say under law, because when you write something, and what's happened with tobacco industry, they write too much in the 50s. So you can be attacked. So more powerful you are, more powerful you are able to not let some part of knowledge outside some small rooms where a discussion took place. So this is not science and technology studies, but it's very interesting when we come to see how to study the ignorance. Very quickly, because I think I am too long. What I want to finish my talk maybe by highlighting some points that can introduce our discussion. What I want to maybe to put on the table after this presentation is what we have learned from the ignorance studies, from agnotology, and science and others, and how we can broad or know these studies. Should we study the ignorance, or should we move to other things? My point here is maybe to say that sometimes it's not easy to define what are the frontier of ignorance and knowledge. And this difficulty of course, means that we have different forms of ignorance, of course, and we have seen some of them here, but there are other forms, and it's important to continue to identify them. But in a world where crises are important, and when conflicts are also important, how can we broaden these studies? So one point is, I think, to study the entanglement of ignorance. There's different typologies, of course, but there is different level of ignorance. So how these ignorances are assembled, I don't know if we say it in English, in the same time in some situation, and entangled in a way that they produce a configuration which makes it very difficult to act at one level, only at one level. Sometimes you have too much data to produce uncertainty, social doubt, but in the same times you can have not enough data to make your argument more strongly. So how can we study this kind of situation? The second point, I'm going very quickly here, is that in these situations which are very complex, such as, see here, the plastic in the ocean, the continents of plastic, we know a lot about the plastic, we know a lot about science, we know, in fact, we are not ignorant of the problem of the plastic. However, the science on this can be produced, can be seen by some groups and not by other groups, and can be in conflict with some everyday life and other problems. Environmental problems are one of the problems, or health problems are one of the problems when they are in conflict with work problems, with access to employment, access to health, how people deal with that in everyday life, but also how some institutions play political strategy on these hesitations, the fact that our world is not just made on one word, but from different interests, different social groups, and this playing on different priorities and interests is probably one thing that continue to maintain some area of ignorance. In these situations, we can know a lot of things. I think the global warming is probably the main problem and main case we know about. We know. I mean, we know now for years. We have international consensus, and why there was no public action on that is not just because there is bad guys in some bad guys. It's very, very complex situation. So we need also to document this situation. And maybe the last point I want to introduce to finish my talk is that we need to broaden the studies on ignorance. Maybe first this point, because I forget it, is about the uncertainty and certainty, and it's an important one, because agnotology, as I mentioned, really highlight the importance of scientific consensus, but it's important to know, of course, we know about the global warming, but in other areas, there is still a lot of undone science. We don't know exactly, I mean, this is not the last, the planetary limits, this is the one before, and this changing, and we don't know very well about the planetary health, critical zone. This is like a new scientific area trying to tackle the complex situations when it's not always easy to know with certainty. As social scientists working on science, we know that uncertainty is really an important part in science, and we will always have uncertainty. So the problem is not, of course, to have scientific, we can have scientific consensus, but sometimes we can't have scientific consensus. And in some cases, even when we have scientific consensus, it can be a bad consensus. I mean, I can develop this point in the nuclear industry, for example. For a long period, we had a consensus on the fact that there was no effects to the exposure of low doses. Now, the low doses paradigm is dominant in exposure science. So the science can change, but what do not really change is that uncertainty is always part of science. But my last point now is really to highlight the importance of having, having more broad studies in ignorance, extending the spatial scale of the study of ignorance, mainly through the global south, because all the works I mentioned was mainly focused on the Western countries. Of course, we have now several studies on Latin America, on Africa, but we still need to have more work to bet, not just because it's not just matter to have work on the global south, but really to broaden the different kind of ignorance that we can observe, and especially the relationship between ignorance and power. And in these studies, one important point that the new political sociology of science highlighted in many cases at local level in the US, which is the question of the inequalities, how the maintenance, how to say, really maintenance in very sociological approach, the maintenance of ignorance is also the maintenance of certain social words, because ignorance, and this is what in fact Proctor and Oreskes show concerning tobacco and global warming, is not the problem for me, is not the global or the scientific consensus, but the work done to maintain some social relationship or some inequalities or some organizations in the society. So this is another way to think about ignorance. It's not the only one, and I will finish with this point. It's important maybe to promote and to maintain plurality and different way of approaching ignorance. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We can start the discussion. I think that the people who are following us online, you just can open your microphones and ask questions, and people in this room, if you want to start the debate, go ahead. So,
I have a question on the study by Barbara Allen that you mentioned. Is that one of Orsugnet? No, because I attended a meeting in Aix-en-Provence on this on environmental issues, and actually there they had produced a film, no, like Xavier Damaran, Laura Cementelli, on this issue, and they were starting like a study. And I think that it is that afterwards, like 2 years later or 1 year later, Barbara Allen went there and did the study. So for me, it was also interesting because when they showed this case, they organized there like a kind of meeting where the different social agents were present there, or the municipal authorities, the members of that were getting this data, scientific data, and there were issues that appeared there that were clear that they were collecting a data that they could not show the impact on health on this population because it was included in a bigger region. So there were like issues that were clear from outside that there was a problem there. No? But I think that maybe the presence of Barbara Allen coming from the United States, important university and so on, was also important, as well as her approach. I don't know if you have followed the issue and you know why this issue was at stake for a long period and the impact that Barbara Allen's study had on that issue.
Your question is very fine question, a very complex one. I think really there's a difference. I follow very well this study. Of course, the area, there was doctors, you know, general doctors, family doctors, mainly private. You know, in France, you have family doctors who are private people, highlighting that they have a lot of asthma. This is what we notice. This is very common in all the industrial area, that doctors asthma. I have asthma, so in Paris, asthma in Paris. A lot of general doctors notice that, but it doesn't mean that, you know, from scientific point of view, that it's true, because usually the regulatory agencies, so there's a perceived health issue. We don't know if it's really air pollution or industrial pollution. You need to show the relationship between causes and else. So in Fos-sur-Mer, of course, I mean, when you know, the area is very nice, beaches. Of course, if you don't look to the industrial complex, petrochemical, etc., people like this. I mean, I know people living there, they find it very nice area. Its wages are not too bad. They have houses, you know, and for the regulatory agencies, what Barbara Allen did, the difference, I think, and it's important difference because it's like small controversy in some milieu, is saying, oh, she didn't care about what people were doing before. Probably she's, I mean, I know her very well, and they had this discussion. She didn't care about workers, for example, and workers did a lot of work on the health, but she used the methods which isn't the method of Philip Brown's. It's not community-based research. It was more scientifically strong. She worked with epidemiologists from Paris, French epidemiologists and American epidemiologists, and she worked in very, how to say, not just to highlight that there is a very scientific way, very data collecting, interviews, and working with people on the ground, with the other people didn't do. In fact, this is my this discussion we have. Of course, they notice there is an institute, an important institute there, Éco-Citoyen, etc. But they didn't share what she showed diabetes. And her methods were, I mean, she pushed the public, especially the public health agency, to criticize its methods. Because of course, it's not the golden case epidemiology, the way the epidemiologists do their work. And her argument, and this is the difference with general doctors, is I'm not conducting research on the health of the people. I am conducting research on what people are telling to you about their health. And in fact, this study, because of the methodology they used, which was different, put the public agencies in a very uncomfortable way. So she was, of course, she was publicized, not because she was American. I don't think at all that, because she worked, she wasn't alone. She worked with Joanne Alice, who is an anthropologist, Yolande Ferrier, who was, the anthropologists did a huge work with people on the ground. And I think why her study was also powerful, because she worked very closely with people on the ground. So people, in the beginning, nobody cared about that, but she really succeeded in pushing. I'm very long on my response. So I will not say that we know what she, of course, we know that, I mean, like in other places in France, that people living in that very polluted area are ill. But we don't have other studies. So it's beginning now, because people are trying to do the same studies in, I wasn't, but we can have this discussion after. Because I had a lot of discussion with Barbara, because I think that in the beginning, maybe if she worked more with people on the other people working on the same topic, it would be better. This is why some reaction were so strong, French reaction, but they are not just, in my point of view.
One question, not just let me follow in that these different possibilities to remediate the undone science by citizen science, but different ways of organizing this citizen science with different connection with the activists, with the as you were saying. I'm thinking in this book by Max Liborion on pollution is colonialism. This is another more radical, I would say, way to organize chemical analysis of water, in which you have the interest of the fishers inside of the protocol of analysis. So there are many different ways to organize this question. But my point is about this concept you mentioned at the end of entanglements of ignorance, assemblage, constellation of ignorance. When we have many different kinds of ignorance at work, and how to deal with these complex situations with the typology we have, that is useful to refine this typology more and more, and have more and more different kinds of typologies, starting from the three groups of typology of ignorance mentioned in the book by Proctor. Is that is a good idea or not? Or maybe we need to go to particular cases, expanding the geographical areas more far away from the States and from North Europe, and going to Africa. We have studies now, or go to early modern period, for instance, and try to apply some these ideas, or this idea of constellation of ignorance. And the other point is our fragmentation of a group of historians, sociology, STS, philosophers, many different group of people working from different traditions in this group of ignorance studies. So this is my question. What is your proposal for the future of this ignorance studies, taking into account this idea of the complexity of ways or forms of ignorance at work, and also the fragmentation of the community of scholars working on these studies?
Thank you for
sorry.
these two very difficult questions. First on the entanglement of ignorance. Yeah, I mean, we not, because if with agnotology and in science and other ignorance who are studied now, it's obvious that under the banner of ignorance, we have different ignorance. And it's important, I think, to continue to have empirical work to identify, because I'm sure that we still need to better identify what kind of ignorance we are observing. My point in the talk is that the book on agnotology was very stimulating book, very interesting book, proposing a theoretical perspective, which wasn't used completely and broadly, in fact. A part of the perspective was used, of course, with research on the production of doubt or secrecy, or suppression of knowledge for indigenous knowledge. You mentioned Liboiron, But in the book, Tuna and feminist, post-colonial feminists were developing this kind of approaches. So we are coming back to what some people did 20 years ago. So it's important to fully work on these concepts, sorry. And so my second point is, do we need typologies? I will say yes, because probably I'm a historian, but I am a sociologist. And maybe this is a matter to come back to your question, that sociologists, I'm not fully sociologist, I'm a sociologist of science, but having typologies can help to have discussions with other disciplines, philosophy, sociology. So, to make these typologies, and not just to add typologies on typologies, etc., probably, and your point is right, is to try to solve this problem of fragmentation of disciplines, especially in humanities and social sciences. Maybe we need a workshop with philosophers, with anthropologists, with sociologists, because these people do not work with typology in the same way. And people who have already did real work on ignorance, so it can be the next step. I think it will be quite interesting to try to do that, because we have huge knowledge on ignorance. So if we put our knowledge together and try to map the ignorance, what can we say? And why it's important for me is not because I like typologies, but because it's a way to really try to better define ignorance and the frontiers of ignorance. Because maybe one thing, and I'm not sure what I will do with the ignorance in the future, we tend to read a lot of situations through ignorance glasses. Maybe it's not ignorance. It's the normal way of functioning of our societies. Because if we say ignorance, it means if we know, we'll have solution. I'm not sure at all. Because there are other, or to say it in another way, if we learn what, it's not scientific knowledge, it's maybe the mechanism of the functioning of our society. It can be political knowledge, which can be helpful to change things. So what we ignore exactly, and should we always put it in ignorance perspective? I'm not sure. So I do not have a real answer. I will not say real answer, but final answer to that, because I'm still trying to think what we should do. I'm sure that ignorance is very heuristic, especially today where we are facing environmental crisis, the way we deal with the problems at scientific and political level, the fragmentation, the unseen questions are very, very important topic. But I'm not sure that we can grasp all these problems just with the perspective of ignorance. I don't know if I replied to your...
More question from people following the session.
I'll let you.
Want to open? I think Antonio is going to ask something.
Yeah, it's just a question, and to say hello, Soraya. After so many years, we met again. And yeah, my question is about your point on institutional agnotology. I mean, this idea of institutional production of ignorance. And it's very appealing, this idea of considering that focusing agnotological studies in the intentional production of ignorance is very limited. So to enlarge the approach and consider the production of ignorance as part of the scientific activity. And my question is, it could be considered that as an agnotological practice, in the sense that dilutes the real problem into something more general. I mean, taking the expression of Proctor about the bad boys, I mean, saying that it's not a question of bad boys, but a question of, I mean, a normal scientific activity in which the production of knowledge and ignorance are the two sides of the same coin. So diluting this intentional agnotology into some kind of normal or normality in scientific activity is not, or could be, or there's the risk of transforming it in a sort of agnotological practice because we abandon the focus on the real problem, which is the intentional production of ignorance. Thank you.
Thank you for your question, Antonio, and really glad to see you even on Zoom, to see you again. The institutional production of ignorance, I mean, I mentioned that there are several works on that. I mean, the approach of Frickel and others who show that there are, I mean, they can be in intentional production of ignorance. I mean, because of the normal routines, but the normal routines can be maintained in intentional way, and this is what is happening in regulatory agencies. I agree with you that the standards for toxicants used, I mean, when you have 1 critiques, 2 critiques, 10 critiques, 100 critiques, and they still continue to maintain the same risk assessment methods, it's intentional. I mean, it's not intentional. So this is one way to, of course, to deal with the problem. I mentioned also my Goy, and there are other works on uncomfortable knowledge. I mean, how institutions deal with uncomfortable knowledge. I will reply maybe to a level, I don't know if we should call it institutional agnotology, because for me, this is not my decision. Proctor and others do not deal too much about the institutional ignorance. They were more focused on the public production of ignorance. And they don't really criticize the way some institution and even regulatory agencies produced ignorance for very good reasons, I think, because they don't want to attack regulatory agencies where they were already under attack, especially in the US. So it's a very complex topic. You can criticize their approaches, but you have to be aware that the context is very complicated one, because it's in the name of their how to say limited methods that sometimes industrialists criticize these agencies. So it's very complicated way. But just to go further on the intentionality and no intentionality, I think that Matthias Girel, I mentioned him, he's a philosopher of science in France, working broadly on ignorance, and very interested in this question of intentionality. And I mean, he worked on agnotology. He's really, he contributed to introduce, I mean, agnotology studies in France. And he mentioned the fact that we have gray zones. We have zones where we don't know really if there is intentionality or no intentionality, but we can also see the problem a different way. It's a matter of scale. People at individual scale or at certain degrees, some experts can work with methods and ignore how their methods can contribute to produce ignorance. And this, I mean, let us come back to the issue of entanglement of ignorance. At certain scale, some agencies, I'm thinking to European agencies on food, for example, know very well what they're doing on pesticide why they don't want some standards, etc. But when you come to the experts at very low level, they even don't see the connection between their practices and the effects of their practices. Not sure if I'm clear for you, but I think that institutional agnotology is becoming more clear today because there's changes, you know, from the beginning of regulation and today. But because les rapports de force, I don't know how to say that, the power relationship change a lot on the regulation, in the regulation milieu. We are not in the same world. I mean, the context is another important point. So I'm not replying fully to your question because I think that in my point of view, I would not classify what is in agnotology, what is not in agnotology, because even if Proctor and others try to have like agnotology as the banner for ignorance studies, I personally, I prefer to maintain, I mean, I prefer the approach with ignorance studies, even if I want to highlight the important role of proctors and the colleagues who begin these studies.
Thank you, Soraya. Thank you.
When we're talking about the new sociology of science, about the concept of on-down science, and how this concept is being understood and translated in society in general, and how this helps to fill this space on not-down science as part of the solution, doing research by another kind of groups, not financed by not large corporation or big companies, something like that. I wonder if you could give your own opinion under the theoretical models and your studies of ignorance, how to find a solution to fight against the structural ignorance. That's my comment.
I will say, my God. As a scholar, because, you know, we are in a period when tensions, I would say, are becoming more important, and what we observe on proctor involvement or proctor's involvement or Resca's involvement, I think we should learn something about that they are living in the US, and some aspects began in the US concerning the place of science, the rule of fake news, etc. So some scholars feel that they had to do more than just producing knowledge, to be involved in public space, etc. So personally, I'm still thinking to what kind of position. I will not say we should have, because there is always plurality of positions and plurality of way of acting as scholars, but also as citizens. But concerning this issue of ignorance and structural ignorance, I act in a different level. I was part of the scientific board of one of the French public agencies of environmental issues. So we introduced social sciences. We were the first who were on social science. So we push a lot to work on some topics. And if Barbara Allen was funded, it's not complete. I mean, it was publicly funded. It's not completely hazard. No, not hazard, but how to say, hazard. And we really try to have studies like the Barbara Allen one, but other studies on, we have huge debate, a huge issue on incinerator, the biggest incinerator in France, near Paris. And we worked with students We show where is the problem, we interview people, we work with association on the ground, but we also work with the public agency because we don't think that the regulatory agencies act in very bad way sometimes, but they are important because we are in period of deregulation. So how to push these agencies to do their work because they are publicly funded, this is my argument. You are supposed to do that. I'm not naive, but we had a lot of discussion with them. We also organized a huge meeting with CNRS and Emmanuel Henry on how to have inclusive, not participatory, inclusive research on the ground with people and having this communities, organization, NGO, giving them the voice as any researcher, as any public actor. And really public actors were shocked what they heard, because we want them to hear these people. And now we have it's becoming like in the US, we have groups of people acting because there is new methods, low cost captures, and they can also pay studies from Netherlands. You have to pay studies in Netherlands on France to have some studies on incinerator, for example. So this is at one level, it's to push for the adoption of new way of collecting knowledge, because I believe that knowledge is important as academic. The second, maybe the other way to, and this is, I really believe in that, is to produce analysis, to show where is the structural ignorance, what is persistent, to do our job as academics, but in very critical way, not just to be involved, but really to produce very serious, how to say that? This is a huge discussion, especially in France. We have a lot of colleagues now who don't care about academia. They are involved in social movements. I have no problem with this. I usually say that I can be a very radical person, but I believe in the academic work. Because why? Because you give resources to people to think about their situation, about the way the society is organized. And you have to do it in a very serious way, because even you have critiques, you will always have, this is very conflictual topics, but not on the scientific aspects. I worked for a long period on the nuclear risks. I have critiques, but I don't care, because I can have discussion with any specialist of the topic, because what I'm saying is not my opinion, it's a scientific work. This is why scientific knowledge can be powerful, sometimes, not always. So it's important to continue to do that, but it's also very important to have social movements, because this is what Proctor came to that at the end, because science is not supposed to organize everything in our society. I do not believe that science is very important dynamics in the society, but there are other more important dynamics, social organizations, etc. So I think that we should act at different levels. It's not enough probably, but this is how I see the problem. Thank you.
So if you don't have any more questions, I think we can finish with these thoughts about the connection between academia and activists, which are so important for center as this one, in which we are promote this kind of connection, are so difficult to establish, and we need to think very much about. I think ignorance studies are a preferred field to discuss this point. What is our social role as historian or sociologists of society? So thank you very much, Soraya.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you.
I think now it's time to finish the talk and go to have some lunch.
Thank you.
between
The coordinate.
yeah.
Yeah.